Hey everyone, Charlie here from the Atomic Age, and today we're doing Chernobyl. Yes, finally getting to Chernobyl. Just the first episode today. There's a lot in this show. First episode is definitely one of the most impactful. So the Chernobyl accident really needs very little introduction. It's the worst nuclear accident in human history. Reactor had a runaway chain reaction that resulted in a powerful water steam explosion and resulted in the release of millions upon trillions of becquerel of radioactive material. And this show is very good at capturing the raw emotion of it. There's some inaccuracies, which is inevitable in a dramatic recreation of an event. So I plan to try and discuss those when I can. Also explain some of the technical stuff. There's a lot of jargon going on in the show. And, the show is almost as much of an essay against communism as it is an examination of the Chernobyl accident. Yeah, this has been a very important event in history. Definitely partially responsible for the downfall of the Soviet Union. Definitely contributes to humanity's aversion to nuclear power. Radiation's a scary thing because our senses, we did not evolve with a way to detect radiation fields. You cannot see it, you cannot feel it as it's happening in the moment. And yeah, this show gets into all the emotions and the raw feel of being on the ground there. So I really liked it a lot when I saw it. It was parts were hard to watch for me as a nuclear safety engineer. And without further ado, let's get to Chernobyl, episode 1.
It exploded.
We know. Akimov, are we calling the reactor core?
We shut it down, but the control rods are still they're not all the way in. I disengaged the clutch.
Can't disconnect the servos from the standby console. You two, get the backup pumps running. We need water moving through the core. That is all that matters.
All right, so they're going through a lot of reactor jargon really quickly here. The control rods control the reaction, obviously. For a nuclear chain reaction to proceed, you need a bunch of neutrons flying around. Control rods are made of what we call neutron absorbers, so they absorb neutrons. So if you insert them in, you kill the reaction, shut down the reactor. And then he's also talking about how it need to keep cooling water moving through the reactor. That's because after a reactor has undergone fission, there's a lot of split atoms in their fission fragments, and these are highly radioactive, which correlates to heat. So it gives off a ton of heat. Even when a reactor is shut down, it could still give off as much as 15% of its rated power load as radioactive decay heat. So you still have to move water through that reactor to cool it down. And if you don't, that's where you can get a meltdown from, because the temperature just keeps going up, because the heat just never stops from the radioactive decay, at least when you're talking about this kind of short time frame.
There is no core. The lid is off. The stack is burning. I saw it.
You're confused. RBMK reactor cores don't explode. Akimov.
So this has become almost like a bit of a meme here. RBMK reactors don't explode. So RBMK reactors, the Chernobyl reactor type, basically to summarize it briefly, it uses graphite as a neutron moderator. Graphite is just carbon, and carbon is a good neutron moderator. It can slow neutrons down. And you want to do this because when you slow neutrons down, fissile atoms, that is to say the fuel of a nuclear reactor, split more easily when neutrons are going slow. It uses graphite as a moderator, so carbon slows down the neutrons, and then it uses water as a coolant, and that's to carry away the heat. Because all a nuclear reactor is just, in principle, a very simple way of making heat, and then you use that heat to run a turbine and make electricity. In Western reactor designs, just about any reactor you come across, especially in the United States, is going to be a water reactor. So it uses water as both a neutron moderator and a coolant. And this is because water has hydrogen in it, and hydrogen is the best neutron moderator. The smaller your atom, the better of a neutron moderator it is. So hydrogen is the smallest atom. Carbon is the 6th smallest element. I should be saying element, 6th smallest element. So the smaller your element, the better a moderator. So for this one, the RBMK, they use graphite as a moderator, which lets you run very low enrichments. I think the RBMKs were also supposed to be used as a way to breed plutonium, make plutonium in a reactor, and then you can use that to make atom bombs. Any reactor that uses water as the coolant is going to be operating at some elevated pressure. And this is because in order to make your reactor as efficient as possible, you want to get the coolant as hot as possible. That way you can get the most energy out of it, because what does heat mean? Heat means energy. So the more heat you have in your coolant, the more energy you can extract from it. So for a Western typical reactor, you're looking at operating pressures of like 1,500 to 3,000 psi, which is a lot. You know, you're talking like 100 to 200 times above atmospheric pressure. And this is all to keep water from boiling, because there are reactors where water does boil, but those are boiling water reactors. So to briefly sum up what I've talked about before, RBMK reactor uses graphite as moderator, water as coolant. So with a Western typical pressurized water reactor, you're looking at a coolant pressure of about 3,000 psi. For RBMK, you're looking at 1,000 psi, which is less, but still a lot. So with Western reactors, you'll see a big containment dome over them, and this is to handle if there was a coolant leak. That high pressure water is super hot, super high pressure. It's going to turn to steam when it hits the atmosphere. So that huge dome over Western reactors is designed to withstand all the water in the primary coolant loop turning to steam. These RBMK reactors don't have that. I may be jumping ahead too much. These ones just basically have a tin shed around them, so no ability to withhold any pressure of any kind. That's not what happened in this accident, though, just a loss of cooling. This reactor exploded. So with their design, it's supposed to be set up that it doesn't explode. I mean, for that matter, Western reactors don't explode either. The only way for a reactor to explode is to have like a huge power excursion where you just get this. I mean, that's what happened here. You get this enormous insertion of power, get like a runaway chain reaction, and then so you don't get a nuclear explosion. What happens is that the water gets superheated so quickly it turns to steam, and then steam is just so much less dense than water and just has such a huge pressure that it has to go somewhere, and then the reactor pressure vessel is not built to withstand that pressure increase, so it blows up. So you get a steam explosion, but you don't get a nuclear explosion per se. You don't get a nuclear bomb. You get a steam explosion. So at the moment, I'm not exactly sure where the claim that RBMK reactors don't explode comes from. I'm not sure if they thought Western reactors could explode, or that their RBMKs were just unique, or it's like, you know, Soviet reactors don't explode, like perfect, nothing can go wrong, or if like just like the thought of a reactor exploding wasn't really considered at the time, because everyone knows about the meltdown. You know, too much heat, the heat never stops. The temperature's just going to keep going up until it melts, but the reactor steam explosion is a more novel concept, perhaps. So let's keep watching, and perhaps we'll see some context clues, or my memory will get jogged as to why RBMKs cannot explode. All right, so it's hard to see at first, but we'll see this later. I believe they're showing. Starting to show some of the chunks of graphite, which would be good evidence that your reactor did indeed explode. Yeah, so these are chunks of graphite. These are not supposed to be outside in the air. You can see in some of them that they're kind of glowing hot red. So when the neutrons hit the graphite, you can try and get it as pure as you want, but there's still going to be some level of impurities in it. You want it to be as pure as possible, because I think graphite has the thing where it has boron in it, which is generally what you find in a control rod. It absorbs neutrons, but you don't want that. That just means your reactor will be less efficient. So you try and make reactor-grade graphite, which is about as pure as you can get, and but you can't get everything out. So with all the neutrons flying around, they hit the impure elements in the graphite, and they turn them into they can turn them into very radioactive versions. So that's why the graphite here gets radioactive. It doesn't have fuel in it, but from neutrons hitting it and turning elements radioactive, which we call neutron activation, they become very radioactive. And radioactivity means heat, so they get really hot. In addition to being like hot from a radioactive standpoint, they're also thermally hot.
Are they bombing?
That was a thought when this first blew up, because this test they're doing is actually in response to Israel bombing the what's it called, Osirak reactor in Iraq. The French helped the Iraqis build a reactor, and Israel didn't like that. They thought it could be used to make bombs. That's neither here nor there. They decided to bomb this reactor. So what this test was supposed to show was that if the reactor got bombed and they lost power, would there be enough energy as the turbines spun down to kick in the backup generators so that they could still keep cooling water going through the reactor? Because, as I mentioned earlier, you have to keep some kind of cooling moving through that reactor to keep it from melting down.
What the fuck is this? It's 3.6 Roentgen. That's as high as it goes.
All right, so they're talking about the dosimeters. They only go to 3.61 Roentgen. So let's go take a look at how high of a dose that actually is. All right, so if you've seen my other videos, you know that I am very fond of this dose rate chart here. It gives you a really good sense of what a certain dose means, and it also gives you some exposure times here. So they were talking about 3.6 Roentgen. They really meant 3.6 Roentgen per hour. All dosimetry devices give you dose as a rate. So it's like in your car, you're mostly worried about your speed at any one time. You have the odometer that tells you how far you've gone, but you really cared about how fast you're going. It's the same kind of thing with dosimetry, because how much dose you get is it all depends on how long you're there for. So you just look at it in terms of dose rate to see what the instantaneous radiation is. All right, so there's 3 different ways to measure radiation. You have exposure, absorbed dose, and dose equivalent. Roentgen is exposure, which has to do with ionization of air. Then we have absorbed dose, so this is how much energy has that radiation put into a material, such as this steel beam or my flesh. And then we have dose equivalent, which is the same as absorbed dose, except it considers the biological effects. So whether that radiation is deposited in a finger or my head or a liver, it has a different effect on how much dose equivalent you've gotten. So it doesn't affect different parts of your body the same way, is really what that's trying to say. So Roentgen is a very base level way of reporting dose, but in an accident scenario, when you're talking about really high radiation fields, it makes sense. So they're not directly convertible, is the point of what I've tried to, is the point of that whole explanation of radiation. But for gamma rays, which is again what we're primarily considering here, they're all basically equivalent. So 1 Roentgen equals 1 rad equals 1 rem. So those are non-SI. The SI unit for rad is the gray, and the SI unit for rem is the sievert. So to go from rad to gray, you just have to divide by 100. So 1 rad equals 0.01 gray, 1 rem equals 0.01 sievert. So we had 3.6 Roentgen, which is approximately equal to 3.6 rem, which is approximately equal to 0.036 sievert. So on our chart here, we have millisievert. So 0.036 sievert is 36 millisievert. And that takes us right here. So these numbers are all in microsievert, but over here we got millisievert, so 36 is right in here. This was instantaneous exposure. This is hours, days, a year, I believe. Yeah. So the 3.6 Roentgen is equivalent to smoking 1.5 packs a day of cigarettes a year. And it's between a CT scan for instant exposure and the maximum yearly dose permitted for U.S. radiation workers. So if you were to stand in that field for, I don't know, 40 minutes or so, you get the maximum yearly dose permitted for U.S. workers. Then just coming down here to 100 millisievert, we have lowest annual dose where increased lifetime risk of cancer is evident. And this is getting it over a year. And then right here at 250, we have the dose limit for U.S. radiation workers and life-saving operations. So it's a pretty large dose they're getting at 3.6 sievert, but really what 3.6, 36 millisievert, excuse me. But what everyone has been saying about not great, not terrible is really kind of true. It really is not great, not terrible. It could be worse, and it could be better.
Valera, your face.
Alright, so by saying, like, your face, I think he's trying to foreshadow that he's already gotten such an insane dose of radiation that he's already showing discoloration on his skin. To already get that this short after exposure, I didn't really say how much time has elapsed, but I think you can assume 5 to 10 minutes. That would be very much a lethal dose, and yeah, for it to set in that quickly, that's insane. Because in my K-19 video, I found a paper that's for doctors in like the aftermath of a nuclear bombing or reactor incident, and you can basically averaged out, like, when someone starts vomiting from radiation exposure, you can guess as to how much of a dose they got. So in K-19, they had to fix a reactor in a submarine, and the doses they got would have led to puking after about an hour, and that those guys got lethal doses. So if he really is showing symptoms of radiation poisoning this early, then he's gotten a very, very large dose. It's just insanity. Like, the firefighters are just running around. There's no one in control. What's happening? Did our reactor actually blow up? What is the radiation actually looking like out here? It's like just hurling people at the problem. It's just, you would think someone would want to, like, see what the radiation levels are like before you just send people running in like crazy. Once you know the radiation levels, if you figure out that you have to send people in, that's a conversation to be had. But we're not even at that point. We're just like, they're just like, we have no idea what's happening. Just send them in. Very brave men. It's very unfortunate what happens to them. And there this guy goes. There you go. Nice piece of graphite. Don't touch it. When I first watched this, I was just like talking out loud to myself. I was like, don't touch it. Don't go near it. But he's holding it. He's right near it. Just getting insane dose at the moment. Alright, so they're showing, I don't know if this is the same guy that just grabbed the graphite earlier, but they're showing him already having this intense reaction to it. Now, I'm not sure about how much time has actually elapsed here, but I don't think you would see that kind of effect this quickly. I think it would take a little bit longer to onset, but again, we don't know how long they've been at it. I don't know how spicy that piece of graphite was, how much dose was that actually giving off, but he was also like holding it, right there in the hand, so it could be plausible. I would personally expect more in the several hour time frame for that level of a burn to set in. But again, this there should be like accounts of this, so maybe it did really happen this quickly, but I wouldn't expect it to happen this quickly. So this door obviously goes, I don't know about obviously, but it goes to the reactor hall, so it's really thick, to shield it. So people walking around while they're doing loading or unloading operations to the reactor, or while it's running, so they don't get unnecessary dose. But yeah, that's why it's so big. The adage for shielding is more mass in the path, so the more stuff you can get between you and radioactivity, the better. And also, this is also just another way to show how intense and insanely large this explosion was, because this huge door has now been warped out of position and won't open easily. Dude, let's just let this sink in for a second. They're looking into where the core used to be. Whatever's left of it now is now raging with this intensely fiery inferno. Just looking at this for a matter of minutes is enough to get a lethal dose. Perhaps even less than that. I mean, just incomprehensible and just utterly terrifying. I'm at a loss for words. I don't know how to describe it. It's just so, like, scary. Just the worst case, all your fears coming true. As a nuclear safety engineer, it's just, ugh. So we're looking at the Radiation Emergency Medical Management website here. Back in the show, we just showed this guy bleeding from that exposure to dose. I don't think that's what would happen. You wouldn't bleed that quickly. We're just going to kind of guess as to what kind of dose they just got. So 50 million microsieverts, that's 10-minute exposure to the Chernobyl reactor after meltdown, according to this chart. They were there for just a few seconds, I don't know, so they might be more in the 5 million range here, which, since it's micro, 5 million times micro is 5, so it's 5 sievert, which is 1 gray. So if they were to get, 0.75 to 1 gray, they might not even get any bleeding, according to this chart here from this radiation emergency medical management chart here. Vomiting would start at about 3 or 4 hours. So they are kind of exaggerating what could be happening to these guys. Even if you go up here to 30 to 45 gray, so that's right in line with this. This is 50 gray. There's not even a time for them to bleed. This is basically saying, okay, so it says 100% deaths at 2 to 4 days, so they die before they even get a chance to bleed. I'm assuming this means external bleeding. But yeah, so I don't think you would expect to see any kind of external bleeding like that. But vomiting here starts maybe within half an hour to an hour. And yeah, evacuation of the bowels. Vomiting starts before nausea. That's curious, but yeah, horrific dose rates. But don't expect any external bleeding.
Take him to the infirmary. Topped enough. Take him.
Yeah, he didn't puke just then. He may in the coming seconds here, but again, to reiterate, I don't think they would have puked so quickly, but again, there's also records of this. Maybe they did really puke this quickly. We're also not completely sure of the scope of time elapse here. Like, it could, I don't think it would take them an hour to walk back from the reactor or so, but I can understand putting in for like dramatic effect from a movie making perspective, but I can also get behind the idea that it's scarier if nothing happens at first and all of a sudden later then starts coming in. I think that could be more impactful, but it could go either way.
Do we stock iodine? Iodine.
You mean disinfectant?
No, pills. Does the hospital stock iodine pills?
So when you split uranium atoms in a reactor, one of the primary things you get left over is iodine 131. And what happens with iodine when it gets in your body is it wants to go to your thyroid, which is in your neck. And then it just kind of sits there and continues to emit radioactive particles right into your thyroid there. So it can lead directly to thyroid cancer. If you take an iodine tablet, the theory goes is that chemically, non-radioactive iodine looks the same as radioactive iodine to your body. So if you take an iodine tablet, the non-radioactive stuff goes to your thyroid, and in theory, it saturates your thyroid so that no radioactive iodine 131 can then go in there and give your thyroid radioactivity, a radioactive dose continuously. It'll still go in your body, but it just won't go to your thyroid. So that's the science behind the iodine pills. In a lot of scenes in this, you'll hear little cracklings in your ear from the audio. That's kind of to simulate the effect of radioactive particles interacting with like the circuitry or the speaker of the probably the circuitry of the microphone. You get a similar effect on film. And I think even digital too. I don't know that the show shows it, but you would expect in like an insane radiation field to actually see the radioactive particles interacting with the film or the camera sensor and making like a filmy grain on it. And the audio might get that snappy, crackly, poppy thing. It's a really nice, subtle touch there. Very eerie.
The large dosimeter from the safe, the one with 1,000 Roentgen capacity.
What was the number?
There was none. The meter burned out the second it was turned on.
Burned out the second it was turned on, 1,000 Roentgen.
I don't see how it could explode. But it did.
Enough. I'll go up to the vent.
This engineer's a very brave man. Rule number 1, the universe is not obliged to make sense to you. Just because you can't see how something happened does not mean that it did not happen. Oh, this response is so very infuriating for me to watch because it is not driven by a desire for the truth or understanding or safety of people. It is driven by pure self-interest and preserving self-image. And it's very infuriating to watch.
I'll see it with my own eyes.
Case in point. Okay, so Dyatlov just vomited. We are approximately, it said we're around like 5:20 a.m., so we're about 4 hours after the explosion. Based on this chart, it seems like Dyatlov may have received a dose of around 2 gray. There's a wide variety of range here. 2 gray is right around here. Highly targeted dose using conventional radiotherapy in a very short time frame. Found near the Fukushima tanks. Yeah, so he's definitely above the threshold for radiation sickness here.
His face.
Ruptured condenser lines. The feed water is mildly contaminated. He'll be fine. I've seen worse.
What about radiation?
3.6 Roentgen per hour.
From the Feedwater, I assume. The Feedwater. Been around it all night.
So they keep mentioning the Feedwater. That's actually in the second loop at the power plant. The primary loop is the water that flows around the graphite moderator channels to remove heat from the core. And then the second loop, the heat from the first loop is transferred to the second loop. And then it goes to the turbine, spins the turbine to make electricity. So they're talking about the water in that secondary loop. So the way radiation hurts you is that it damages your DNA and it keeps your cells from being able to reproduce, among other things. But it generally it makes your flesh and organs just start failing. And it's all horrifically painful and disgusting and vile. And I feel so bad for those who've had to go through it. All right, and there we go. First episode of Chernobyl. I enjoyed this series thoroughly. It's a big downer. There's not too much of an uplift from it. It's really kind of just more of like a dramatized documentary than some kind of movie with like a satisfying narrative thrust. Yeah, I mean, the show really just does do a great job of just trying to convey, maybe even more so than about the disaster, but just like the system around Chernobyl that allowed this accident to happen. Definitely a very much anti-communist bent to it. Like any major disaster, a bunch of different things had to come together at once for it to happen. And the show will work through a lot of those factors as we move along here, but it's just insane. Still the worst nuclear accident in human history. Just so impactful, thousands of people displaced by the accident, radioactivity spread all around. The world doesn't find out about it until a monitoring station in Norway notices the radiation. Just a horrific accident. I thoroughly recommend the series, overall. Really gives you the sense of what the on-the-ground feel was like when the reactor blew up and just the immediate effects and everything. There's always going to be some inaccuracies in the show. A director is always going to take creative liberties to portray things in a certain way to convey certain emotions, but that's all fine. In their mind, it serves, a narrative thrust. But so it's kind of interesting to look at some like the nitpicks or decisions with regarding some of the physics, but the overall gist of the accident and everything is fantastic, and the feeling you get of like, oh my god, there's graphite on the ground right there. Oh my god, that guy's vomiting. Look at the burns on his skin. It really gives you the emotional part of it. Whereas, reading an accident report, you get the technical, but, something dramatized like this gives you the emotional feel to it, which is just as important. So, yeah, thank you guys for watching. I will be doing the rest of this series, not all at once, but, each episode separately. So I'll see you guys later in the rest of those other episodes. and hope to see you then.